Hello and welcome everyone joining us today for this high-level panel hosted by the Committee on World Food Security at this year's Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. Our topic of discussion today is responsible land governance for sustainable food systems, the CFS voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land tenure, fisheries, and forests, known in short as the CFS VGGTS. My name is Jennifer Clapp, and I'm the Vice Chair of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the Committee on World Food Security. This is the science policy interface that advises the Committee on World Food Security and provides expert updates and advice on the latest scientific findings around food security and nutrition issues, and also provides policy recommendations for the body. I'm happy to be moderating this session today on such an important theme as land governance and tenure, which is closely tied to the broader themes of this year's GFFA conference, sustainable land use and its linkages to food security and soil health. This year, 2022, marks the 10-year anniversary of the negotiation and adoption of the CFS VGGTs back in May 2012. As with all policy products of the Committee on World Food Security, these guidelines were negotiated in an inclusive manner among member states, civil society, private sector, UN agencies, international financial institutions, the CGIAR, foundations, and other members of the extended CFS family. The process of finalizing the CFS VGGTs was supported by a detailed scientific report of the CFS HLPE on land tenure and international investments in agriculture, which was published in 2011. And the importance of tenure issues and the voluntary guidelines specifically have been highlighted in a number of high-level panel of experts scientific reports since that time, including the recent report on agroecology and other innovative approaches to sustainable food systems, youth, climate change, and support for smallholder livelihoods. Now, while we've had some examples of successful implementation of the CFS VGGTs over the past decade, it's not enough as we continue to face challenges that the CFS HLPE has highlighted in its most recent reports, including the global pandemic, which has pushed up the number of people experiencing food insecurity, also the threat of climate change on our food systems, recent upward pressure on food prices and farmland prices around the world, and continued degradation of our natural resources. The responsible governance of land tenure has a central role in addressing many of these challenges and must itself be addressed head-on. The CFS VGGTs call upon governments to recognize, respect, and uphold legitimate tenure rights. Its guidance promotes best practices for upholding these rights and is based on key principles, including justice, gender equity, participation, transparency, and accountability. These principles are extremely important, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized people whose tenure rights have been, and in many cases continue to be, unclear. So as we celebrate the 10 years of the CFS VGGTs, it's important that improvements are made in the recognition of tenure rights for many. And it's also important to recognize that much more needs to be done and that our work is far from over. With this context in mind, we're delighted to welcome you all here for this panel today. For the next hour and a half, we will hear from our distinguished guests who will be sharing their experiences with the VGGTs. The first part of the session will be a ministerial panel, followed by a question and answer period with representatives from our partner institutions. We will welcome you and our participants to post your questions in the chat, and I will direct them to the speakers as appropriate. To get us going, I want to invite you to watch a short 3-minute video that will give you an overview of the CFS VGGTs, the process of their production, issues they seek to address, and above all, some examples of their application in practice. So here I will ask our colleagues to show this video. Thanks. Great. That's a powerful video that shows us once again the power of what can be done when we come together, but also shows the necessary commitment to bring the VGGTs into practice and to uphold the rights that it seeks to protect. It is now my honor and pleasure to invite His Excellency Ambassador Gabriel Ferrero, Chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security, to kick off the first segment of our panel today. Ambassador Ferrero, in addition to being the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security, represents the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Spain on matters of global food security. And prior to be elected being chair of the CFS in the fall of 21, he served in a number of distinguished roles, including as Director General for Sustainable Development Practices for Spain, as well as serving in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, coordinating UN High-Level Task Force on Food Security. Welcome, Your Excellency Ferrero. The floor is yours for your remarks and also to introduce the other panelists in this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Jennifer. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. As the chairperson of the UN Committee on World Food Security, the CFS, I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming you all to this high-level panel. The panel will look at responsible land governance for sustainable food systems, with a focus on the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure, land, fisheries, and forests, commonly known as the CFS VGGTs. I would like to express first my deepest gratitude to our host, His Excellency Sam Ozdemir, Federal Minister of Food and Agriculture of Germany, who will be participating in the video, for inviting the CFS to organize this high-level panel at the Global Forum for Food and Agriculture. Honorable Minister, Government of Germany, congratulations on your appointment to this critical role. We thank Germany for its steadfast commitment to the CFS, and we look forward to working closely with you to achieve our shared vision of a zero hunger and zero malnutrition world by 2030, a world achieved through sustainable and inclusive food systems. We are eager to hear from you later in the program. I would like to start by thanking the honorable ministers who have joined us today. My deep gratitude and appreciation to Her Excellency Frida Krivka, Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development from Albania, and to His Excellency Ibrahim Touré, Deputy Minister of Fisheries and Marine Resources from Sierra Leone. Honorable Ministers, we commend the leadership that you and your countries are providing on this critical issue, and we are looking forward to hearing how your countries are making use of the CFS VGGTs, and also your advice to others who wish to follow a similar path and adopt the voluntary guidelines. I take this opportunity to assure you of our partnership and support. We are also very grateful to our dear friend, Ms. Maximo Torero, the Chief Economist of FAO, with us today. Maximo, many thanks to you and to FAO for your unwavering support to and partnership with the CFS. The support to countries from FAO and from the UN system has been, is, and will continue being essential to translate the VGTs and other normative international frameworks agreed at the CFS into country-led policies, strategies, and institutions. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, land and its governance is the bedrock upon which all other food security and nutrition efforts are built. Land is the support of soils, of biodiversity, of water, of crops, trees, and livestock, of farmers' livelihoods and cultures, and not least of the harvesting of renewable energies. At the Committee on World Food Security, which was established in 1974 and reformed in 2009 to serve as the foremost inclusive UN platform for global governance of food security and nutrition issues, governance of tenure was among the first major topics we addressed in partnership with member states, the Rome-based agencies of the United Nations, the United Nations system more broadly, and many others. This saw governments, joined by other stakeholders, endorse, as Jennifer was describing, the voluntary guidelines in 2012 as an internationally negotiated framework to improve land governance with a human rights-based approach, with human rights at its center. This year, as Jennifer also mentioned, 2022 marks the 10th year anniversary of the adoption of these guidelines. And also, as Jennifer was introducing, despite these encouraging examples of the implementation of the VGGTs in many countries, the world's attention on land tenure has slid down the global priorities over the last years. Now it is the time to refocus our energies on responsible land governance for sustainable food systems and double down to achieve SDG 2, recognizing land and soils as the crucial foundation issue they are. I would like to share with you 4 recommendations for achieving this. First, recommit. Our government and all stakeholders, we should recommit to uptake the existing global frameworks such as the CFS, VGGTs within our policies, strategies, legislation, regulatory frameworks, and business models. I also urge you to utilize other relevant globally agreed policy instruments at the Committee on World Food Security that are very closely related to the sustainable land use and to healthy soils, such as the CFS principles of responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, or the CFS voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, or the policy recommendations on agroecological and other innovative approaches. The last of these were adopted just last year. Second, integrate. We should refrain from looking in isolation at issues of land, soil, and biodiversity, at the protection and restoration of natural resources and rural prosperity, at healthy diets, and the way in which we produce food. We need to adopt a food systems perspective and take full advantage of the momentum created by the UN Food Systems Summit held last year. Taking a food systems approach will also build strong linkages with other multilateral processes, and these including biodiversity, climate, desertification, and more importantly, within our countries, broader integration of national SDGs or 2030 agenda strategies with the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, and the national adaptation programs of action. Third, think and act locally. We should consider territorial governance dimensions of sustainable food and agriculture systems and of land tenure. This calls for a commitment to balanced territorial development using a food systems-wide approach that takes into account constraints determined by the interplay between geographic, social, economic, and institutional factors. And last, fourth, think and act global. I call on governments and all stakeholders to make use of the Committee on World Food Security as our global platform, an arena to foster dialogue and share experiences on critical food security issues such as land tenure. The committee is a unique UN global platform, also for connecting country-led national pathways and strategies for sustainable food systems, food security, and nutrition. It is the space in which all countries can share their efforts, showcase and review their progress, and connect with the financing for development, community, civil society, businesses, and the research and science constituencies. Concluding, allow me once again to express my gratitude to the government of Germany for inviting the CFS to organize this high-level panel. I'm also grateful to the honorable ministers who have joined us today, and we will be sharing their experiences shortly. And to all our partners, civil society, the private sector, the UN system, FAO, friends and colleagues who have joined us from around the world. As we mark the 10-year anniversary of the adoption of the VGGTs, let's take a moment to celebrate the accomplishments we have achieved, but more importantly, to reflect upon lessons learned, accelerate action in the future, and recommit collectively to the implementation and to the adoption of the VGGTs. I thank you very much, all of you, for your attention. I'll now hand the floor back to Jennifer for the next part of our program. Jennifer, back to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ferraro, for those inspiring comments and excellent recommendations. I am now pleased to ask our CFS colleagues to show a short video message from our host of the GFFA, His Excellency Sam Ozdemir, the newly appointed Federal Minister of Agriculture for Germany. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte Frau Ministerin Grifka, sehr geehrter Herr Vizeminister Turay, sehr geehrter Herr Botschafter Ferrero de Loma Osorio, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, es ist mir eine Freude, das heutige High-Level-Panel des Welternährungsausschusses CSF im Rahmen des diesjährigen Global Forum for Food and Agriculture zu eröffnen. Denn in diesem Jahr widmet sich das GFFA dem Boden, der nachhaltigen Landnutzung und dem fairen Zugang zu Land. Zugleich feiern die freiwilligen Leitlinien für eine verantwortungsvolle Verwaltung von Boden- und Landnutzungsrechten des CFS in diesem Jahr ihr 10. Jubiläum. Leitlinien, deren Ziel es ist, weltweit sichere Eigentums- und Nutzungsrechte und einen gerechten Zugang zu Land, Fischgründen und Wäldern zu fördern. Als Mittel, um den Hunger und alle anderen Formen der Fehlernährung und Armut zu beenden. Unsere Böden, die Bodenfruchtbarkeit, die Bodengesundheit und auch der faire Zugang zu Böden und Land spielen dabei eine wichtige Rolle. Noch sind wir von dem Ziel, das Recht auf angemessene Nahrung weltweit zu verwirklichen, leider weit entfernt. Im Jahr 2020 lag die Zahl der unterernährten Menschen weltweit bei 768 Millionen. Und über 2 Milliarden Menschen verfügen über keinen sicheren Zugang zu Lebensmitteln. Die Pandemie hat die Ernährungsunsicherheit neben den bereits großen Herausforderungen wie der Klimakrise, der Zerstörung natürlicher Ressourcen, Kriegen und Konflikten sowie anhaltender Armut und Ungleichheit angesichts steigender Lebens- und Betriebsmittelpreise weiter verschärft. Jeden Tag können wir es in den Medien lesen. Extremwetterereignisse wie Dürre und Überflutungen vernichten Ernten. Gerade in den Ländern des globalen Südens werden die Folgen der Klimakrise an Intensität und Häufigkeit zunehmen. Und die Nahrungsmittelversorgung wird sich verschlechtern. Das heißt, wenn wir das globale Ziel, kein Hunger, der Agenda 2030 erreichen wollen, müssen wir schnell handeln. Zugleich kann die Ernährungssicherung nicht isoliert betrachtet werden. Denn auch die Ernährungssysteme üben Druck aus auf die Biodiversität, die Böden, die Umwelt und das Klima. Unser Ernährungssystem ist Opfer von Umwelt- und Klimakrise. Es ist aber auch Treiber und damit gleichzeitig ein wichtiger Baustein zur Lösung. Deshalb müssen wir die begrenzten Flächen und Ressourcen für die landwirtschaftliche Produktion berücksichtigen. Wir müssen den Verlust an unversiegelter Fläche und landwirtschaftlich nutzbaren Böden drastisch reduzieren. Wir müssen die Bodenfruchtbarkeit und Bodengesundheit schützen und erhalten. Mit einer bodenschonenden Bewirtschaftung, mit Humusaufbau. Denn nur dann können unsere Böden ihr immenses Potenzial als terrestrische Kohlenstoffspeicher voll entfalten. Und wir müssen für einen fairen Zugang zu Land und Böden sorgen, insbesondere für Frauen und junge Landwirte. Insgesamt müssen wir also die Nachhaltigkeit und Widerstandsfähigkeit der Landwirtschaft und der Ernährungssysteme verbessern. Der CFS hat in dieser Hinsicht wichtige Weichenstellungen vorgenommen, insbesondere mit seinen freiwilligen Leitlinien für eine verantwortungsvolle Verwaltung von Land, Fischgründen und Wäldern. Damit leisten sie einen wichtigen Beitrag für die Ernährungssicherung. Sichere Eigentums- und Nutzungsrechte und ein gerechter Zugang zu Land, Fischerei und Wäldern sind entscheidende Bausteine, um Hunger und Armut zu bekämpfen und zu verhindern und eine nachhaltige Entwicklung zu unterstützen. Der Zugang zu Land stellt sicher, dass sich die Menschen in vielen weniger industrialisierten Teilen der Welt selbst mit Nahrungsmitteln versorgen und gleichzeitig Einkommensquellen erschließen können. Es ist zentral für die Bekämpfung von Hunger und Armut und unterstützt eine lokale Produktion von Nahrungsmitteln, die Klima und Umwelt schützen. Die Leitlinien bieten der globalen Gemeinschaft einen Referenzrahmen für eine faire Ausgestaltung von Landnutzung und Landzugang, um gemeinsam eine Verbesserung der Lebensgrundlagen der Menschen und den Schutz von Boden und Klima zu erreichen. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich bin überzeugt, gemeinsam können wir vieles erreichen, um besonders unsere Böden und unsere Umwelt zu schützen, den Hunger zu bekämpfen und die Ernährungssicherung zu verbessern. Dem CFS danke ich herzlich für die Unterstützung bei der Ausrichtung des heutigen Panels. Ich wünsche Ihnen viel Erfolg und einen erkenntnisreichen Austausch. Vielen Dank.
Great, thank you. We now have a video message from Her Excellency Frida Krifka, Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Albania. Before showing this video, let me stress that she will be speaking about FAO's guidelines on strengthening gender equality in land registration in Southeast Europe, which was one of a number of technical products prepared by the FAO to help implement the CFS VGGTs, which aim to raise awareness of gender equality issues in relation to the registration of property rights. We will add a link to these technical guidelines in the chat so that you can access them. The Albanian government's been supported by the FAO, the German Development Cooperation Agency, and other development partners in strengthening gender equality in land ownership and control towards achieving SDG Target 5.A. Now I'm pleased to share this short video message from Her Excellency Frida Krifka.
Distinguished Chair, distinguished speakers, dear participants, I am delighted and greatly honored to be invited at the 2022 Global Forum for Food and Agriculture to present Albania's progress on SDG 5.A based on FAO guidelines on strengthening gender equality in land registration in Southeast Europe. The Albanian government has affirmed its commitment to recognize, respect, and safeguard tenure rights of lawful holders. Gender equality in access ownership and control of land is pivotal to foster inclusiveness, reduce poverty, and enhance women's productive and entrepreneurship capacity to ensure equitable and sustainable economic growth and development. It is well articulated in various strategic documents, including the National Strategy for Integration and Development 2014-2020 and the new National Strategy on Gender Equality 2021-2030, the new law on the notary aimed at guaranteeing women's property rights with regard to property protection, while the new law on the state cadastre aimed at regulating gender equality elements with regard to property registration. Better collaboration between public notaries and land registration offices contributed to reduce traditional gender-based discriminatory practices in land holding. Even though the Albanian government has made great efforts to improve policy environment related to gender equality in land rights, monitoring of this indicator is very challenging. More efforts should be made to encourage joint land registration through economic incentives in the case of unmarried couples and raise awareness of women about their rights to land. In the context of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development will harmonize its interventions with other ministries and stakeholders to succeed in achievement of the country's vision for the 2030, including the development of concrete tools and mechanisms to ensure monitoring of SDG 5.A. I would like to thank you and wish you a very productive forum.
Great, thank you, Her Excellency Frida Krifka. Though she couldn't be here today, that was a great video message. We'll now turn to our distinguished panelists who are joining us live for this event. And first off, we will hear comments from His Excellency Ibrahim Touré, Deputy Minister of Forests and Marine Resources from Sierra Leone, who will speak to the work done by the government of Sierra Leone to implement the CFS VGGTs at the country level. The floor is yours, Minister Touré.
Thank you very much, Jennifer Clapp. I want to thank Mr. Chair and more especially the government of Germany for inviting FAO to organize this forum in Germany today. We're very much hopeful and that, during these deliberations, we'll throw light on more important issues that are having issues that are covering the world food systems. I'm here representing my minister, Honorable Makuwa Jalo, who is not present here today, and she has asked to convey apology. The Global Forum for Food and Agriculture we are attending today will be discussing issues that are central to the government of Sierra Leone, the people of Sierra Leone, the Ministry of Fisheries, and other MDAs. We are therefore excited to participate in the 2022 Global Forum for Food and Agriculture deliberations. The government of Sierra Leone wishes to express its sincere thanks and appreciations to the FAO, the World Bank, the UNDP, government of the Republic of Germany, Irish government, the UN, and other stakeholders for the continued support towards sustainable natural resource governance and the implementation of the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forestry in Sierra Leone. The implementation of the guidelines in Sierra Leone over the past years has underscored remarkable achievement in natural resource management landscape. Please permit me to highlight a few of these achievements. One of the key achievements of implementing the guideline is the implementation of the multi-stakeholder platform, which is held yearly, and it brings together experts from all walks of life to discuss tenure governance and provide recommendations to the central government. Through the implementations of the multi-stakeholder platform, a critical mass of informed stakeholders and community of practice have been built. This promotes the participation of communities, local authorities, traditional leaders, and the local councils in the governance of natural resources in the country. I'm happy to inform you that the institutional framework, which constitutes a secretariat, technical working group, steering committee, and interministerial task force also underscore one of the key achievements of the implementations of the VGGT. The institutional framework is the mechanism put in place to sustain and support the multi-stakeholder platform. The Ministry of Fisheries is currently holding the chairmanship of the interministerial task force within the implementation framework of the VGGT. We are working together with colleague ministries that implement the CFS VGGT remains a recurrent activities within the relevant ministries. I'm proud to inform this gathering that the institutional framework has enriched the process and procedures for the governance of natural resources in Sierra Leone. It has promoted collaborations and coordinations between MDAs, CSOs, development partners, local authorities, and traditional leaders in natural resource governance, and has created a space for debates on tenure rights and the governance of those rights. Principles of the VGGT inform the formulations of the 2015 National Land Policy, the 2018 Fisheries and Aquaculture Act, and the 2020 Gender Empowerment Policy, and the 2021 Gender Empowerment Bill, as well as the 2021 National Land Commission and Customary Land Bill. These reforms are critical to enable non-state actors such as the local communities, stakeholders, and indigenous people, and all of you here present to participate in and benefit from the country's vast natural resources. Finally, I'm delighted to see the representation of a diverse set of stakeholders, private sectors, central government, civil society organizations, landowners, and women's group, and youth, academia, and international NGOs, and etc. in this gathering to deliberate on the governance of tenure issues on land, forest, and fisheries. And I wish you all of us a fruitful discussions. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Ture, for those enlightening comments and the importance of stressing the need for multi-stakeholder consultation as well as attention to issues of gender in securing land rights. Thank you. We will now hear from Dr. Maximo Torero, the Chief Economist from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, who will speak on the FAO's use and application of the VGGTs. Dr. Torero, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you very much, Ambassador Ferrero, and thank you very much for Germany for this kind invitation. I will do a brief presentation of what we are doing at FAO on the voluntary guidelines and how we are observing the progress of the work being done. So let me start first by looking, since the endorsement of the voluntary guidelines, FAO has led a program to disseminate the VGGT to improve governance of tenure. And substantial progress was achieved regarding the VGGT awareness raising in over 78 countries, facilitating changes in land policies and legislation through development of multi-stakeholder platforms, supporting capacity development of stakeholders, and supporting land policy reforms based on the VGGT. Further commitment to advance the VGGT and a stronger collaboration among all the stakeholders is required to build on the achievements, and also to be able to scale up the results of what we have been doing. Since the adoption of the VGGT, the initial priorities of FAO work was on awareness raising, on embedding VGGT policy principles in formulation or revision of policies and laws, on capacity development of stakeholders, primarily through multi-stakeholder platforms, and on addressing global environmental issues by improving governance of tenure through the VGGT, and the UNCCDP COP14 resolution concerning land degradation neutrality. The program has achieved substantial awareness regarding the VGGT and tenure challenges in numerous countries, as I said, around 78 to date, and has induced changes in policies and practices through empowerment, policy dialogue, and the development of MSPs, both at national and local level, in a dozen of countries, focusing on capacity development of stakeholders and supporting important land policy reforms based on the VGGT. The most recent VGGT evaluation, published in June 2021, recommended that the program should consider the following. First, to develop a subnational and sub-regional programs on governance of tenure, anchor actions in existing action plans, roadmaps at national level, participate actively in donor groups, and further implement concrete actions on the ground, develop additional areas of work under the VGGT, and continue to promote exchange among countries and continue supporting national and local stakeholder platforms. So action at the country level is central on what needs to be done to continue the implementation of the VGGT. Now, the key results of implementing the VGGTs can be summarized in the following slide. Essentially, to enacting new laws, legislation, or improving existing laws that recognize women land rights in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Niger, Senegal, Albania, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Serbia. Recognition of pastoralist communities' land rights in Nepal, Mongolia, and the Sahel River Basin countries, and Afro-descendant ethnic territorial rights in Colombia. An establishment of 3 transhuman committees in Mauritania. The implementation of methodologies for alternative land disputes resolution in Tanzania. Improved process for review and approval of land investments in Ghana, Nambia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Liberia. And securing youth women tenure rights under customary systems through new innovative methodologies in Sierra Leone and Guatemala. New land titling programs in Colombia and other countries, and joint administration of national parks territories by National Parks Agency and indigenous communities in Colombia. Just to give you some example, the National Land Policy formulated in 2019, results of Edats Generacs du Fancier land tenure reform under aegis of President of the Republic of Niger. It demonstrates a high level of commitment in the country. Similarly, here I show the example of the policy changes of the VGGT special recognition on the UNCCD in the 14th session of the Conference of Parties of the COP14 in New Delhi, which requests a secretariat that invites the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and other relevant partners to collaborate to produce a technical guide on how to integrate the voluntary guidelines in the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security into the implementation of the Convention and land degradation neutrality, taking into account national context for consideration by the Conference of the Parties in its 15th session. Now, we have contributed in several countries to the legal and policy initiative, as I mentioned before, and we are working in 43 countries, which are here shaded in light blue, through the participatory process in each of them. Similarly, FAO has successfully assisted countries in implementing Article 26.2 of the Voluntary Guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forestries, encouraging states to set up multi-stakeholder platforms and frameworks at local, national, and regional level, or use such existing platforms and frameworks to collaborate on the implementation of the guidelines for improved governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forest. Multi-stakeholder platforms on tenure governance can facilitate and promote policy and legal reforms, can create an inclusive space to discuss tenure issues, can promote buy-in for responsible governance of tenure, and support tenure processes based on ownership, and contribute to improve governance of tenure, and finally, can strengthen capacities at national and local stakeholders. FAO currently supports 29 multi-stakeholder platforms in 17 countries, as is shown in the map, promoting participatory decision-making on both governance and tenure and natural resource management. And FAO supports multi-state platforms, stakeholder platforms, which are intrinsically inclusive based on buy-in from government authorities and other key stakeholder partners. Now, this is an example of the multi-stakeholder platform of diversity and legitimacy of MSP in Nigeria, 9 sectors represented. And these were able to allow us to create a national multi-stakeholder committee in charge of preparing the national land policy. This is extremely important because it creates a participatory process where we can bring inclusive process of decision-making and convert this into something that ends into legislation, which can be implemented at the country level. Often, implementing of land information systems require a high level of IT experience and expertise and significant investments. To overcome these difficulties, FAO has developed the SOLA suite, which you can access in the website of SOLA. Just search for FAO SOLA, a set of free open source tools aimed at improving tenure governance by increasing transparency and reducing the cost for recording and managing existing tenure rights and right holders in customary or formal tenure systems. The set of tools is flexible and adaptable to specific needs. The SOLA suite includes 2 major groups of products. The first group is land administration, comprised of SOLA registry, SOLA estate land, and SOLA systematic registration. And the group 2 includes community tenure recording, which is open tenure, comprised of open tenure mobile applications for field collection and community server for processing the collected field data and registering claims. The initiative module includes in the SOLA suite is a tool that can be used to manage all packages from both groups. And all these tools are freely available in the website of SOLA, and also the codes that you can use to be able to implement these systems. These are only some examples of results that are happening at country level. We have in Ghana, the Volta River estuary, where an NGO and fisherman communities were trained to adapt and use the OT for securing their traditional rights over the river in 127 fishing farms map. Something similar in Sierra Leone, in Guatemala, in Uganda, and also in Guatemala and Sierra Leone together, where rural youth mapping their land, and youth were trained in surveys ready to map, survey land, and collect mapping the data, which allow us to have a spatial platform of this type of information. There are good practices for scaling up the VGT implementation. And in this sense, we believe that multi-stakeholder processes through multi-stakeholder platforms at country level have been fundamental for the dissemination and uptake of the VGT by national governments. Capacity development of stakeholders is key, and more efforts and resources should be allocated in this area. Changes in policy and legal framework is a mid to long-term process which requires sustainable technical support over time, like what we have been developing in SOLA. And new technologies also, especially with the importance of digital technologies today, may be leveraged to facilitate the scale-up of legal recognition of tenure rights, particularly under customary tenure. Finally, integrating land tenure into land degradation, neutrality, and climate change mitigation is of crucial importance today, given the pressures that we are having because of climate change and how the agroecological conditions will change across the world. This is a topic that has to be central, and that's why it's so important to scale up what we learned from the VGT. So, Chair, let me conclude by saying that we are not achieving the change at the scale that we require to fulfill the SDGs. but still we can do it. The celebration of the 10th anniversary of adopting the VGTs is a unique opportunity to reaffirm commitments to securing equitable land tenure and to promote the required changes at the scale. In order to do that, FAO considers that some key actions are necessary. First, to reaffirm the commitment of all actors on promoting and supporting the VGT. Second, to increase the coordination and collaboration between all actors at each country to promote the change at the scale. Third, promote an evidence-based assessment of the trends on the land tenure, giving visibility to the changes and best practices. In this context, FAO is engaging with partners on establishing a global land observatory, issuing a land tenure and governance report, and taking part on joining a global advocacy agenda on land tenure. Fourth, mainstream the VGT in other strategies, policies, and programs, such as the rural poverty eradication, climate change and adaptation, and COVID-19 recovery. This is central today, given the importance of this building back better after COVID-19. Thank you very much, Chair. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torrero, for giving us that excellent overview of the policy implementation at the national, at global, and intergovernmental level of the VGGTs. And it really is good to hear all of the different activities and measures that are necessary to bring those VGGTs into practice, but also you've really enlightened us about the many challenges that remain and the need to renew our commitment to the VGGTs. So thank you very much for those insightful comments. Before we move to the second portion of this session, I'd like to ask each of our live panelists here, Minister Chire and Dr. Maximo Torrero, each a question. And I'll start with a question for Minister Chire. I'd like to ask, given the importance of the fisheries sector for your country, Sierra Leone, what has the government done to achieve food security, and how in particular have the CFS VGGTs been useful as a catalyst to assist Sierra Leone as well as other countries to achieve food security and nutrition for all? Thanks, we'd love to hear your comments on that question.
Thank you very much. With regards to the fisheries, just like as you rightly said, fisheries is very important to Sierra Leone. As we know, it serves as a social engine socioeconomic engine for creating revenue, for generating revenue, creating employment, and also food security for the mass populace. And for us to really exploit the resources sustainably, we really have to make sure that we put in place right policies that are inclusive, as well as that take into consideration gender and also vulnerable peoples that exploit that resources. So with that, we make sure that the principles and the strategies that are within the VGGT, it guides us to developing our policy, as well as the regulations that we passed in 2020 and also the 2018. Because since we came in this government, we find out that the fisheries resources was under heavy pressure in terms of exploitations. So we tried to put in place policies that will try to reduce the fishing efforts and try to put management measures in place that will help us to rebuild the stock again, but at the same time, taking into consideration the livelihoods of the people, especially the small-scale fishermen. So within the policies that we've set, we have determined, defined areas for exploitation, especially for the small-scale fishermen, which is about 6 nautical miles from the coastline, outshore. And that place is specifically meant for the small-scale fishermen. And though before the incursion, before this government came in, this new government came in, the industrial fishing vessels were coming into this, they were competing in this inshore exclusion zone, which is the 6 nautical miles with the artisanal. But with the new policies and the new regulations that we've put in place, fines regimes have been increased tenfold, which have served as a deterrent for the industrial vessels to come in. And also, we have increased our stakeholder participations, in decision making, so that communities have been, we've formed, co-management associations along the eight coastal districts, to look into the management, the responsible management of the resources. And also within those co-management associations, the rights of the communities are well defined there, and also they participate in the management of those resources. They have subcommittees that will look at the environment issues, the biodiversity, as well as the surveillance, the patrol of the community patrols, within the coastal waters, so that people that are using the illegal fishing activities will be brought to books. Also, the government is procuring a whole lot of legal fishing nets, because there is there's a lot of illegal fishing nets, like multi-filament nets, that have been used indiscriminately. So we are working on that to replace those bad fishing nets and bad fishing methods, by constantly consulting with the communities, sensitizing them, training them about responsible fisheries and the governance also. So we are replacing those bad nets with the good nets at a subsidized rate for them, along the coastal communities. Also we focus also on gender into the fisheries. So the ministry is presently strengthening the capacity of women. We have a project that the government is funding, which is called Women in Fisheries. We're working on them to train them to kind of enhance their livelihoods by training them on how to use how to smoke fish, by building improved smoke ovens that will kind of reduce the exploitation of the mangroves, and by so doing, you help the environment to be stable and try and be resilient, especially for the spawning areas, because those areas have been, the vegetations around those areas are the mangroves, and they use a lot of mangroves to smoke their fish. So by bringing in innovative methods, in smoking, they use a little bit of woods, and then we ask them, we are now training them to use other woods as fuel woods, and also to ask them, to sensitize them also to continue to replant trees as they cut the replant. So there's a whole lot that we are doing, with regards to the sustainable exploitation of the resources. The resources are under pressure. We have developed a management plan, and that management plan is very inclusive, and it was very much participatory with all the stakeholders, including the industrial as well as the small scale, to look at the state of the resources and then come up with plausible measures that will help us to, improve and rebuild the stock, but at the same time, exploit the resources sustainably. So the number of fishing vessels, the industrial fishing vessels that are operating, we have now reduced those ones drastically. Before, when we came in, the number of fishing vessels, we are at about 150. Now we are operating within 60 to 70, and 60 to 70 vessels, at a time. But yet still we are conducting periodic fishery stock fish stock assessment to make sure that we know we get a better idea and a better knowledge on the status of the resources, so that will help us and will inform us to put in place rational policy decisions, with regards to the amount of fishing effort that we need to control our resources. So there's a whole lot going on, and we do all these things with intergovernmental participations, because we have meetings with the Ministries of Lands, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Gender, because these issues with regards to fisheries are intertwined. You have all these ministries, MDAs that come together. We look at the issues as a common issues and try to find ways how to control it. So basically, that is what we are doing. There are challenges, but we continue to sensitize the fisher folks, with a view to enhance and build their livelihoods.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister Ture. That's great to hear all the measures supporting the fishery sector and the livelihoods of the small-scale fishers in support of food security. We'll now turn to a question for Dr. Maximo Torero. Maximo, you mentioned that we're not achieving change on tenure rights at the scale and speed necessary to fulfill the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd like to ask, what do we need to do differently? How do we pivot to speed up and extend the effectiveness of the VGGTs going forward? And specifically, what plans does the FAO have in this respect? Thanks.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question, because in the first years, we have been focusing a lot on awareness raising and sensitization, and of course, implementation at some levels and with some country cases, as I showed before. But I think now, after 10 years, it's time to scale up and to scale up the VGGTs across the board. And that requires that we increase investment on land tenure at local, national, and international levels, and increase collaboration by all actors. And this is not easy. This is a topic which is extremely sensitive, but I think it's time to start to bring these best practices that we have been working and trying to go through the regions and through the countries to try to implement them and to make them a reality at a bigger scale. And to enable this change, we need to reaffirm the political commitment to the CFS VGGT and give visibility to land tenure-related issues. We need them to bring them back. Land tenure issues will be central for inclusion, for protecting indigenous people, for protecting our biodiversity, to assure that we have policies to mitigate climate change that are sensible and not benefit a group and not benefit another group. It's central that we bring back up into the discussion and to huge visibility this CFS VGGT. But for sure, it's not only asking others to do things, FAO also has to act differently and has to accelerate the process. And in that sense, FAO is collaborating and contributing by engaging with partners on the establishment of a global land observatory, as I mentioned before. And this is issuing a land tenure and governance report and undertaking joint global advocacy agenda on land tenure. We're also going to link the work we do on land tenure and the VGGTs to the work we do on investment. And that's how we are reforming our investment center also in FAO to be able to have a bigger impact on investment at the country level. And that's where having and bringing into any policy discussion that we do with our IFI partners and all our partners at the level of country level investment will be central. It's a topic that also needs to mainstream through the follow-up of the Food System Summit in the hub that is hosted at FAO, but also trying to work with the countries in the transformation pathway so that they take into consideration the importance of the CFS VGGT on land. FAO has also and will continue implementing a Pan-African land tenure policy program, strengthening the implementation of the VGGTs and on the African Union framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa. across the continent. This will be central. As we know, there is significant importance of this topic in Africa, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is at the same time the continent which is facing significant problems of food insecurity because of different drivers, conflict, slowdown, downturns, climate change, now because of the acceleration of COVID-19 and the lack of vaccination. But is a continent, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of work is needed, and this African Union framework on guidelines on land policy in Africa is the perfect mechanism through which we can accelerate our work. And finally, the recent 1.7 billion pledge by governments and private funders to support indigenous people and local communities forest tenure rights show the greater collaboration that can lead to game-changing initiatives. So it's time to act, it's time to make plans and to involve into significant policies and guidelines at the regional and sub-regional level and at the country level so that we can achieve the scaling up of these CFS VGT policies, which voluntary guidelines, which are central to achieve the SDGs 1, 2, and 10 especially. 10 is inequality. If we don't touch on this topic, inequality won't be reduced. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Torero. That's really helpful to hear all of the things that need to be done and the sustained commitment that's needed. We do have a few questions in from the chat. I think we have a moment or so to ask another question or two. And one of the questions that came in, really it was directed to Maximo, but I think other panelists might want to speak to it, especially perhaps Ambassador Ferrero, which is there a multi-stakeholder platform addressing questions of land tenure specifically for youth? And so I don't know if any of the panelists want to speak to that specifically, or Ambassador Ferrero, if you'd like to join in, and then I'll give the others an opportunity to also chime in on that question.
Thank you, Jennifer, for directing me this question. Well, the Committee on World Food Security is indeed a platform for all the stakeholders. And this year, precisely, the committee is undertaking the preparation of policy recommendations on youth employment and their engagement in agriculture and food systems, where youth and young people are participating already and at the center of the deliberations through the different mechanisms and ways to engage within the Committee on World Food Security. And of course, within these policy recommendations on how to engage youth in agriculture and in food systems through employment and through their empowerment, land tenure is one of the critical issues that will be addressed. We are actually in this discussing how can we best engage with youth within the committee. And it's first member states. The governments have committed themselves to bring young people to their delegations within this committee, something that is very unique in the United Nations system broadly. Also, the different mechanisms that articulate the participation of different constituencies are engaging within their own constituencies, youth and young people representatives within the negotiations and bringing their voice through their mechanisms. And these are the private sector mechanism. This is the way in which the business community participate in the committee. And also within the civil society mechanism, which is the mechanism that groups all the different civil society organizations, farmer organizations, indigenous peoples, women's organizations, and others. So indeed, there are different ways in which the CFS also serves as this international platform for youth to engage within the negotiations at the global level on land tenure in a broader sense of youth engagement in agriculture and food systems. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Gabriel. That's great to hear about the focus on youth at the CFS level. I don't know if Maximo or Minister Chure would like to chime in. One of the follow-up questions to that one was specifically about opportunities for African youth to engage on this question.
Yep, may I? So since last year, FAO launched the World Food Forum, and that's a forum led by young people. It started with many agencies. Last year, we had the first meeting the first week of October, just before the World Food Day and the meeting of the CFS. So this year, we're going to do it again. And this World Food Forum is driven by youth, and they are the ones discussing this type of topics. So it's a huge platform where we are covering all regions of the world. So African youth are more than welcome to be invited. They can search the World Food Forum FAO in the webpage, and they will see how to register and be part of that. But the important thing is that there is an assembly in which they discuss these topics and where they can bring up these topics to all the stakeholders. And what we are asked and what they are trying to do and what we are working with them, because the idea is to work together with them, they are trying to find ways in which they can act. So not only say these are the things that we, the youth, want, but also to say how they can support those things to change to create the agri-food system transformation. So the VGGT are crucial for that. And I am more than happy to see the interest of African youth to join this group. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Minister Touré, if you wanted to chime in and let us know about the participation opportunities for youth in Sierra Leone and the multi-stakeholder platforms you mentioned.
Yeah, within the context of Sierra Leone, the multi-stakeholder platform, the Ministry of Youth is part of that platform, and we are working very close with them. And over this period, they've come up with a series of projects. They have youth in fisheries project and also youth in agriculture. And the government have provided a lot of support in those areas to help the youth in agriculture as well as in fisheries. Just recently, last year, the government provided about 10 blank boats for the youths, the Ghana type boats for the youths, including all the accessories, as well as providing them a startup budget to help them, move on with their livelihoods. There are other areas that the government is working, with the hope of helping the youth to come into, to make them useful, also, there's the issues with that, especially under the land tenure, is that we have limited land use, we have limited land, and then with a lot of competing interests. So the multi-stakeholder platform, is working to make sure that this conflicts, are discussed, and at the same time, try to improve on the use of the land by looking at the importance of the youth involvement into the use of the land for agriculture and also for fisheries. So we're working with the Ministry of Youth in that area.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Minister Touré, for those insights on the process in Sierra Leone and the engagement of youth. Given the time, we do now have to shift to the second part of this session, which is a moderated Q&A with additional partners of the CFS. We will have a video message from someone from the CGIAR, who I'll introduce in a moment, someone from the private sector, and someone from the civil society mechanism. So first, we'll have a video presentation from Ms. Ruth Meinson-Dick from the CGIAR, who she was unable to be here to give her comments live today, but she's a senior research fellow in the CGIAR's policy-focused institution, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and she works extensively on questions of land policy in a range of countries. So please join us in watching her remarks.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about lessons from CGIAR research on the why and how of secure tenure and responsible land governance. I'm Ruth Meinson-Dick from International Food Policy Research Institute. Most of us in this meeting probably know why we need secure tenure and responsible governance for sustainable food systems. But when the CGIAR started a program on collective action and property rights, we were often asked why. Because the CGIAR is associated more with sustainable food production. So why should we be concerned with these kinds of issues? This graph was our answer. If we think about any of the agricultural technologies or natural resource management practices, if we think about their time horizon and their spatial scale, the longer the time horizon, the more we need secure tenure for people to have the incentive and the authority in order to make those investments in the resources. If we move above the level of an individual farm, then we have to have coordination mechanisms across people. And those are governance arrangements at lower levels. Collective action has the advantage. At higher levels, the state does, and what's important is how they work together. So a lot of what we do requires attention to these issues. For example, security for sustainable practices like investing in soils means having the legal right and also the ability to access and control a plot of land. That's just the starting point, though. Our recent PIM research under the CGIAR research program on policies, institutions, and markets has shown that the negative consequences of tenure insecurity in terms of lower investment in the land, lower agricultural productivity, less likely to escape poverty, and poorer nutritional status for the children. Now, then, if we agree that tenure is important, a lot of tenure work looks only at private lands. For sustainability, we need to consider the commons as well as private lands. And because the commons provide important ecosystem services upon which agriculture and all of us depend. Our CAPRI and PIM research has therefore looked at collective tenure as well as household and individual tenure, and looked at women's land rights within each of these categories. If we look at what has caused tenure insecurity, we see that very often it's the very things that we're often promoting in terms of commercialization of agriculture, active land markets. Those are creating tenure insecurity for women pastoralists, groups with less power. Elite capture during the titling process can also increase tenure insecurity. And weak law enforcement, breakdown of customary systems, and limited awareness of rights are all factors. When it comes to securing tenure for household and individual lands, the main mechanism that's been used, especially in Africa, is registration of customary use rights or customary rights. But those rights registration programs have been unevenly or sometimes poorly implemented. And that lack of effective implementation decreases the tenure security of women, migrants, poor landowners, those people who have less well-documented and subsidiary rights. Inadequate financial and technical capacity, rent seeking, all of these limit the implementation of these reforms. And it's not enough to just implement state laws, but you have to look at social norms in tandem with that for women's rights to be secure. And we have tools now for that. For collective tenure, securing that titling or registration of the territorial rights of communities or indigenous peoples have been useful. Community forestry or fisheries concessions and co-management or joint village land use planning are all useful mechanisms. But again, the implementation matters. You need ongoing engagement and capacity building. Multi-stakeholder processes have been very useful in arranging this, and organized social alliances such as Indigenous Peoples Associations have been instrumental in supporting these rights. and furthering reforms. The VGGTs have the potential to provide soft law to empower these marginalized groups. They include multiple types of resources, which is important. And we've worked on, for example, the implementation guide on the commons and women's land rights. All of these are very useful. We have a lot of resources on our PIM website, and I'm very happy to follow up with anybody who wants more information about any of these studies and initiatives that have been done. Thank you very much.
Great, a very informative video from Ms. Meinson-Dick, and I guess we'll see whether that will be able to be posted if people want to watch it again. We'll now have a brief panel exchange with representatives from the private sector mechanism as well as the civil society mechanism. But we will allow our participants to first give a few opening remarks before we engage in question and answer. So first we'll hear from Ms. Cesare Cantamara from the private sector mechanism. Ms. Cantamara is a professional farmer and she serves as chairperson for the Ingabo Farmers Union. The floor is yours, Ms. Cantamara.
Merci, Madame la Modératrice, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I can be part of this high-level panel today. I would like to thank you very much indeed for this invitation. We all know that land rights and tenure rights are indispensable for all food systems and that they are very important for securing food security on a whole. So working land titles and tenure rights depend on the right to food and that we implement this step by step. We need to find investors on a national level, but also on an international level. This is the most important driver for fighting poverty and for economic growth in the developing countries. 20% of capital flows and 80% of jobs are affected by this in the developing countries. This means a lot of money needs to be spent for development. Many food businesses and agricultural businesses engaged in these voluntary guidelines, and they committed to implementing them. And this has an effect on tenure rights of land and forests and fisheries. We take a look at these rules with regard to the various systems we have in place. However, partly there are no tenure rights of land. So this is why it's important to have a local administration, to have a land register office to register rights and titles. And in order to do so, we need new mechanisms. And what is also important is the role of women's access to land. They have a lot of experience when it comes to implementing the guidelines in Rwanda. There's a ministry in charge of that. There are various institutions like EMA, the Rwanda Environmental Management Authority, REMA. This is an institution in charge of the administration of land rights. There were also various laws also on private investments as regards climate change mitigation. And of course, we also need to register the governance of tenure for married couples, where husband and wife have the same rights. For women who are not married, it's more difficult, but we want them to have 100% of the rights as a security vis-à-vis banks, and when it is about to generate income for families. This would be a sound basis for long-term investments. A few weeks ago, we adopted a master plan for land use. So now we are able to plan our activities better. We have a basis of clear and unambiguous criteria now. At the moment, we are implementing a program in Myanmar. This is in the south of our country. It's often affected by droughts. It's a dry area where people live from forestry, and we need to fight soil erosion there. So we need to protect the river boundaries, we need to plant more trees, and we need to engage in sustainable fisheries in order to protect all ecosystems. Women have a major role to play here too, also when it comes to land tenure. Let me mention the example of the Rwandan Director for Land Management and the Youth Authority. She's a woman, and me too, as a farmer, form part of the Forestry Commission of our district. As a representative of the farmers, Rwanda is very active in the climate change negotiations within the framework of COP. Our cooperatives, the union or cooperative in Gabon, I'm the chair of this cooperative, adopted new rules for our methods. For instance, for manioc, I could give you an example. Here we have developed green technologies and applied them. As regards the production of manioc, I would like to apologize for the technical problem. This is about soil conservation, and due to these new methods and the new criteria, we can protect soils better. And we can engage in crop rotation, so we don't need to cultivate manioc all the time. We can also fallow some part of our fields. We need to fight soil erosion. And in particular, during the dry season, we need to take a close look at what we're cultivating there. We need to make sure that arable land remains fertile. In part, we have little rainfall, and we would need much more precipitation for the farming sector. So there's not enough arable land, and with these new technologies, we can achieve high yields. For instance, we cultivate manioc, and the production is estimated to amount to 15 tons. This is to say that we need to use less seeds in order to achieve a production of 40 tons. And what we're also trying is to reduce competition among areas, so cooperatives get a guarantee that if they use less pesticides and fertilizers, that this will be rewarded then. So this means that there are control elements to make sure and to see how much pesticides and fertilizers have been used, and there are also sanctions for that. So there's an exchange among institutions, in particular as regards manioc producers. This is also about pathogens, to make use of varieties which are more resistant to diseases. The same applies to forestry. We create ever more nurseries, and there various cooperatives can take part. Land law in Rwanda is considered to be favorable for gender equality, and small-scale farmers are also taken into account. And we keep bearing this in mind when we implement political measures. We also need to make sure that we avoid waste, which is not degradable. And we need to show farmers how to act in order to avoid waste.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms. Kantamara. We're running near the end of the program, and we need to create some space for Ms. Brites to speak. So could you wrap up?
Yes, this was really the end of my presentation. So, as I said, we have the private sector mechanisms, and we are working for implementing the VGGTs. We are cooperating with our member businesses, and we also carried out various awareness-raising measures. And this is very important for the food systems and also for the global sustainability goals. The guidelines are very important here and can make an important contribution to achieving these goals. At the end, I would like to say something as regards my assessment of the situation, because it's important to have clear rules at national level on land use so that farmers know how to implement all this. This is essential in order to be successful and in order to successfully produce food worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kantamara, and for the perspective from the PSM. And as I noted, we're running a little bit behind because of some of the technical difficulties, but we would like to now hear from Ms. Perla Alvarez Brites, who's representing the civil society mechanism. Ms. Brites is a small-scale farmer and is active in the peasant and women's organization Kanamuri in Paraguay. Ms. Brites, the floor is yours, though I will caution we only have a few minutes left, so if you could keep your comments brief, and then we'll post the questions that come in and the answers on the CFS website. Ms. Brites, the floor is yours.
Muy buenos días para mí, buenas tardes para otras partes del mundo. Muchísimas gracias por la oportunidad de esta intervención a través de esta forma virtual. Agradecemos la invitación al mecanismo de la sociedad civil, en cuya representación, mecanismo de la sociedad civil y pueblos indígenas, en cuya representación estoy dando estas palabras. La realización de este Foro Global para la Alimentación y la Agricultura, que viene realizándose consecutivamente por 12 años, nos parece como un espacio importante en el que se plantean algunos avances, pero también necesidades para la realización efectiva de lo que tiene que ver en materia de alimentación y agricultura, y en este caso particular, el lema de este año que nos reúne, tiene que ver con el tema de la tierra y los suelos. En ese sentido, para comenzar, quisiera decir que estoy hablando desde Paraguay. sabrá el mundo entero que estamos en este preciso momento pasando una ola de calor extremos, producto de justamente las desigualdades en la tenencia de la tierra y de la forma del uso del suelo. Entonces, partiendo de esta realidad, quisiera decir que a 10 años de la adopción de las directrices voluntarias para la tenencia de la tierra, agua y pescas, para los pueblos.
10 years after adopting the VGGT, for the indigenous communities, the rural communities, and farmers, and for everybody who is living in rural areas, we believe that it is a progress and that some of our rights have already been recognized and that some problems have already been addressed in connection with the prosperity against the background that we organize, we mobilize, and we all are looking for prosperity and for wealth. So that means we strive to get it towards getting our human rights realized. That means 10 years after the VGGT were adopted, we really were successful in having an instrument on the part of the United Nations which makes the realization of these rights possible. And it is of utmost importance that we have our instruments implemented through these instruments. I can only speak about the Latin American region and about the Caribbean region, but I think this is the same in most of the rest of the world, but I mainly refer to this region here. In the middle of the pandemic, it was said that there was a global problem which is caused, or which has been caused by COVID-19. And I have to say that in the midst of the health crisis, we've had expropriations. And this is one of the topics on which we have been working. That is, that these guidelines are really implemented, because due to this expropriations, which were also violent, that is, the families are in a terrible mental health and health situation and nutritional situation. This is the same in Paraguay, Peru, Colombia, and other countries. And in Colombia, we've also had this armed conflict. And despite of the peace treaty, this has not yet been solved. And this leads to a situation where the governments and the ministers of agriculture and everybody involved here calls for action. And these guidelines can be a very important instrument, on the one hand, for making sure that the tenure rights are respected. We want to live here. We have our culture. We have our economic basis here. So the land is our territorial basis and our basic foundation for realizing our rights and to protect the environment, not only for us ourselves here, but also for the entire humankind, which is threatened by other crises around the world, for instance, extreme cold spells, inundations, desertification, heat waves, and so on. So we all suffer from the lack of respect for the environment, and this leads to nutritional insecurity. And we are very much affected here. Therefore, this instrument provides us with the opportunity that we can address our problem, for instance, access
to finance, in particular for women, but also for other farmers.
Las desigualdades que estos llevan en términos de disfrute de derechos son muy grandes.
For instance, access to finance is a very important problem. So we are talking about the necessity that 10 years after the adoption, it is important that states are involved, that the civil society and academia, that everybody shares in or makes a contribution to public policies that make sure that there is a responsible land governance. We are living in a very unsecure environment. We have expropriations, we have economic business interests, monocultures, and therefore we have these expropriations. And we think that the governments and ministers of agriculture everywhere, and also fisheries ministries everywhere, because I'm not talking about agriculture but also about fisheries, and therefore this situation also has to be taken into account. And therefore we believe for the application of the VGGT to be efficient, we need to demand the implementation of agricultural reform, not the agricultural reform of the last century, but an agricultural reform which is based on implementing human rights, and which also includes indigenous people, but also other peoples living in the countryside. And we can also share innovation with our knowledge. And we believe that this is what can lead to a situation where there
Thank you, Ms.
where SDG 1 or 2 can at least be implemented at a minimum level. I would like to say in conclusion to all listeners that we demand that 10 years after the adoption of the VGGT, we have efficient public policies which establish a link between agricultural production, human rights, and the VGGT. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brita. Sorry to encourage you to wrap that up. We are over time and due to the technical difficulties, and we do have to wrap up the session. But I'd like to turn now to pass the floor briefly to Chris Hagedorn, who will give us some closing comments and close out the session. Though he's also got some technical difficulties, so hopefully he'll be there. So I'll pass it on to Chris, and thank you everyone for participating.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay? Excellent.
Yes.
Well, thank you again, especially for waking up so early. Let me thank the CFS chair, Ambassador Ferrero, other distinguished speakers and guests, and of course the German government for hosting the GFFA and giving us as CFS the opportunity to organize this event on the CFS VGGTs, and particularly the importance of land tenure in achieving SDG 2 and many other goals of the 2030 agenda. It's a special moment, as the chair said, 10 years this May of the adoption of the CFS VGGTs. Shortly after as well, the September 2021 UN Food Systems Summit, and at the early stages of the UN Decade of Action on the SDGs. So the chair's emphasis on our taking a food systems approach reminds us how important the governance of tenure is for our collective global efforts to end hunger and malnutrition. This is where CFS and its unique multi-stakeholder platform is so important, as it brings together all the major stakeholder groups in a way that no single UN agency or financial institution can do. Let's continue to use CFS to share our experiences and our dialogues on what works and maybe what doesn't. And this will be an important goal of an event we are planning in May to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the VGGTs and highlighting just how important tenure is and where gaps remain to be filled. So the German minister highlighted the important role of soil and land and the major challenges of climate change, COVID, poverty, noting the importance of the VGGTs and the key platform offered by CFS. The Albanian minister spoke to the critical role of gender equality on issues of tenure and described their work to address these issues in their national policies and programs, with central government's strong commitment to a multi-stakeholder approach, with help from FAO and others. The Deputy Minister of Fisheries of Sierra Leone stressed how important the VGGTs have been for developing their national laws, programs, and policies with help of development partners. He stressed the importance of an inclusive approach to developing their own national framework for tenure governance, including with traditional leaders, civil society, and many others. FAO's chief economist detailed their efforts to raise awareness on the CFS VGGTs and the numerous programs and actions to implement them in 78 countries. He mentioned the SOLA program and other efforts to use new technologies and information to increase implementation of the guidelines and to increase efforts underway to develop a global land observatory in the coming year. We'll keep an eye on that. Important questions raised that we will follow up as a committee and in concert with others working on land tenure. We heard an interesting discussion of what the CGIAR is doing on tenure, including their work to take landscape perspectives and to give due attention to the commons, as well as the crucial need to focus on women's tenure and other drivers of tenure insecurity. The CSM and the PSM noted their efforts to implement the VGGTs and some of the challenges faced by their membership in doing so, including the critical importance of respecting rights of the most vulnerable. Final takeaways, let me just summarize by saying this is a critical moment for the 2030 agenda and for global food systems transformation, where tenure governance plays a huge role, with the CFS VGGTs having become the global reference document to address many challenges linked to hunger, malnutrition, climate change, poverty, which are related to land tenure and land governance. Globally, we simply are not achieving change at the scale needed to address these major challenges. 2022, as we said, is the 10th anniversary of the VGGTs, and we will continue to use CFS and its global platform to highlight this topic, including in May and as well as the CFS 50 in October. Again, let us thank all of our distinguished guests and speakers, the German government for hosting this. And again, we stress how important and how crucial it is for all of us to redirect political attention and funding towards land tenure and land governance for the full achievement of the 2030 agenda. Thank you, Jennifer, again, and thanks everybody for being here with us today. Back to you.